Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The Curse of the Family Photo.
The family reunion had become an annual highlight, a day filled with laughter, food, and stories under the blazing sun of Austin, Texas. My backyard was transformed into a vibrant scene of celebration. The aroma of grilled meats mixed with the tangy scent of barbecue sauce, wafting through the air as relatives and friends mingled. The sun cast a golden hue over everything, making it seem like the perfect summer day. The yard was decked out with strings of colorful lights and cheerful decorations. Tables groaned under the weight of dishes, potato salad, baked beans, and the star of the show, my grandmother's famous apple pie. Children darted around, their giggles and shouts punctuating the warmth of the day. I watched with a contented smile as my uncle, a jovial man with a booming laugh, recounted old family stories to an audience of rapt listeners. As the day wore on and the shadows grew longer, someone suggested taking a family photo. It was a tradition, a way to preserve the memories before everyone scattered back to their lives. I eagerly agreed and went to fetch my camera. It was a simple digital model, nothing fancy, but it had served me well for years. I called everyone over and began to arrange them in front of the large oak tree in the center of the yard. The oak was a majestic old tree, its gnarled branches spreading out like protective arms. It had been there for as long as I could remember, and it seemed the perfect backdrop for our photo. The sun was setting behind it, casting a warm, diffused light that made the scene almost magical. "All right, everyone, gather around," I called out, directing people to their spots. My cousin Jamie struggled to keep her two young children still. The kids were bouncing around, their faces flushed with excitement, and their antics were causing some mild chaos. "Say cheese," I instructed, snapping the picture as everyone smiled and posed. Just before I pressed the shutter button, I felt an inexplicable chill, a cold draft that seemed to cut through the summer heat. I glanced around, but the windows and doors were closed. I shook it off as a figment of my imagination, maybe a sudden gust of wind or the air conditioning kicking in unexpectedly. The camera clicked, and the moment was captured. As the party continued, I moved around, talking with family and enjoying the evening. The photo itself wasn't given much thought until later that night, when I sat down at my desk to review the pictures. The image was perfect, everyone was smiling, the colors were vibrant, and the backdrop looked picturesque. But as I scanned through the photo, my eyes were drawn to a peculiar detail in the corner of the frame. There, partially obscured by the shadow of the oak tree, was a dark, amorphous shape. It was indistinct, almost like a smudge, but the more I stared at it, the more I felt a sense of unease. The figure seemed out of place. It wasn't anyone from the photo, and it certainly didn't belong there. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen, but the shape remained stubbornly vague. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a play of shadows and branches. I even showed the photo to a few relatives who were still around, but they all dismissed it with casual comments about how it was probably just an artifact from the camera. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. I decided to keep the photo, though. Maybe I'd have it looked at later, I thought, but for now, it was just a quirky detail in an otherwise happy memory. Little did I know that this seemingly innocent photograph was the beginning of something far more sinister, a curse that would unravel our lives in ways we could never have imagined. The days following the reunion were filled with the usual post-party lull, cleaning up, sorting through leftover food, and catching up on work. For a brief moment, I managed to push the unsettling feeling about the photo to the back of my mind. Life went on, and I began to think the shadowy figure was nothing more than an overactive imagination. That is, until the accident started. It began with Jamie's son, Liam. One afternoon, while playing in their backyard, he took a tumble down the stairs. It wasn't just a simple fall. He seemed to lose his balance in a way that defied explanation. He landed awkwardly, twisting his ankle and cutting his forehead. It was the kind of accident that made everyone stop and murmur in concern. The doctors couldn't pinpoint a clear cause for his sudden loss of coordination. I tried to ignore the nagging feeling in my gut, but things only got worse. A few days later, my Aunt Margaret's car, her pride and joy, was involved in a bizarre accident. The brakes failed while she was driving on a quiet street. She managed to steer it into a ditch without anyone getting hurt, but the car was totaled. The mechanic was baffled. There was no reason the brakes should have malfunctioned. My sister, Emily, started having nightmares. She woke up in cold sweats, screaming about a shadowy figure that lurked in her dreams. It was always the same, a dark, indistinct shape that seemed to follow her, whispering things she couldn't quite understand. Her fear was palpable, and it spread through our family like a contagious illness. I tried to reason it all away. Accidents happen, right? Bad luck, coincidences, these things don't have to be connected. But every time I saw the photo, with that dark shape lingering in the background, I felt a growing sense of dread. It was as if something was building up, waiting for the right moment to strike. One night, while I was lying in bed, I received a call from Jamie. Her voice was frantic. "You need to come over," she said. "Liam's been hurt again. It's like he's cursed or something." I rushed over to their house. Jamie met me at the door, her face pale and drawn. Liam was sitting on the couch, his leg propped up with ice. He had fallen again, this time from a small height, and had bruised his ribs. The doctors were stumped. They couldn't figure out why he seemed so accident-prone lately. As Jamie and I talked, her husband walked in with an envelope. It was a letter from the local paper, asking for information about the recent accidents and offering a reward for any clues. It seemed like an odd coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was at play. Over the next few days, I watched in horror as the accidents continued. One after another, small but increasingly serious mishaps plagued our family. Each incident seemed to be more dangerous and inexplicable than the last. I started to feel like we were being watched, or worse, that something was deliberately targeting us. I knew I had to take action. I couldn't ignore the connection between the accidents and the photo any longer. I began to research, looking for any clues that could explain what was happening. I wanted answers, but every step I took seemed to lead me deeper into a nightmare I wasn't sure I could escape. The shadowy figure in that photograph was no longer just an oddity. It was a warning, and I had to uncover the truth before it was too late. The sense of unease grew with each passing day. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was terribly wrong, and it felt like it was closing in on us. I knew I had to dig deeper, so I set out to uncover the truth behind the eerie shadow in the family photo. I began my investigation by rummaging through old family records and stories. My first stop was the local library, where I spent hours scouring through microfiche and dusty old newspapers. I was looking for any hint of a similar phenomenon or historical events linked to our family. One afternoon, as I thumbed through the brittle pages of a local history book, I stumbled upon something chilling. There, in an obscure corner of the text, was a reference to a curse that had plagued a family in our area over a century ago. It was described in a faded, yellowed newspaper article, detailing a series of tragic accidents and mysterious deaths that had struck a family living in a house that once stood on our very street. The article mentioned a shadowy figure seen in old photographs, believed to be a harbinger of misfortune. The description matched the shape I had seen in our photo: dark, indistinct, and haunting. The legend spoke of a malevolent entity bound to the family's history, an entity that thrived on capturing its victims in photographs. My heart pounded as I read about how the curse would bring tragedy to those who were unfortunate enough to capture its image. The figure was said to be a remnant of a dark ritual performed by a troubled ancestor who had sought to bind a malevolent spirit. The curse, according to the article, would linger in the family line until it was confronted and broken. I needed more information, so I sought out local historians and paranormal experts. I met with a woman named Clara who ran a small bookstore and was known for her extensive knowledge of local lore. Clara had an air of quiet authority and seemed intrigued by my story. She listened intently as I recounted the accidents and showed her the photo. Clara's face grew grave as she examined the image. "This figure you see," she said softly, "is likely linked to an old curse. It's said that once you capture it, it attaches itself to you and your family. It thrives on fear and misfortune." She suggested that I investigate the history of the land where our house stood. I spent hours in old archives, learning about the various families who had lived in the area and any events linked to them. It was a painstaking process, but slowly I began to piece together a disturbing pattern of misfortune and unexplained tragedies that had plagued previous occupants of our home. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that our family was not the first to suffer from this curse. Each revelation seemed to confirm that we were in the grip of something ancient and malevolent. The accidents and nightmares were not random. They were part of a larger, terrifying design. I felt a heavy weight on my shoulders as I realized the gravity of our situation. The curse was not just a legend, it was real, and it was active. My family was in danger, and I had to find a way to stop it before more harm came to us. Clara suggested that we perform a cleansing ritual to break the curse, but the process was complex and fraught with danger. With a sense of mounting urgency, I began to prepare for the ritual. I gathered the necessary items and reached out to Clara for guidance. The next step would be to confront the curse head-on, to face whatever dark entity was lurking in the shadows of our lives. As I prepared for what lay ahead, I could only hope that we would find a way to break free from the nightmare that had taken hold of us. The days leading up to the ritual were filled with a palpable sense of dread. Every creak of the house seemed louder, every shadow darker. The accidents had become more frequent and more severe, and the fear was spreading through our family like a contagion. I was losing sleep, and my nerves were frayed. It felt like we were on the brink of something horrific, and I couldn't escape the feeling that the curse was tightening its grip. One evening, I received a call from my cousin, Sarah. Her voice trembled with panic as she told me that her husband, Mark, had been involved in a serious accident. He'd been driving home from work when the car suddenly swerved off the road and crashed into a tree. Miraculously, he survived, but he was in the hospital with multiple broken bones. The accident was as inexplicable as it was violent, and it left me feeling even more desperate to end this nightmare. The following night, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, going over the details of the ritual with Clara. She had instructed me to prepare various items: salt, candles, herbs, and a ceremonial dagger. The ritual was supposed to expel the malevolent entity and cleanse our home, but it required precise execution and a strong will. Clara had warned me that the entity would resist, and that the ritual could be dangerous. As I prepared the items, I was jolted by a loud crash from the living room. Heart pounding, I rushed to find my elderly father lying on the floor, having fallen from his recliner. He had a gash on his forehead, and his glasses were shattered. He was conscious but disoriented, and he kept muttering about seeing a dark figure watching him. It was another sign that the curse was escalating. That night, I lay awake, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every little noise seemed amplified, and the darkness in my room felt oppressive. I couldn't help but think that the entity was growing stronger, feeding off our fear and despair. The next day, Clara and I set up the ritual in the living room. We arranged the candles in a circle, laid out the herbs, and placed the salt in a protective barrier around the room. As we began the ritual, I felt a heavy weight in the air, an almost palpable presence that seemed to push back against our efforts. Clara chanted incantations from an old book, her voice steady but strained. I followed her lead, holding the ceremonial dagger and focusing on the task at hand. The room grew colder, and the flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls. I could hear faint whispers, almost like distant voices, and the air seemed charged with an unsettling energy. Just as the ritual reached its climax, the lights flickered and a loud, guttural growl echoed through the room. The temperature dropped sharply, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I turned around, but there was nothing there, just a chilling emptiness. Clara's face was pale, and her eyes were wide with fear. She continued the chant, her voice wavering. Suddenly, one of the candles blew out, and a dark, shadowy figure appeared in the doorway. It was the same figure from the photo, now more defined and menacing. The entity seemed to pulse with a dark energy, its presence making the room feel suffocating. In a final act of desperation, Clara and I pressed on with the ritual. The figure writhed and twisted as if trying to escape the circle of salt. The whispers grew louder, and I felt my resolve wavering. I could see the figure's face now, an expression of rage and sorrow etched in the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, Clara recited the final words of the incantation. The figure let out a piercing scream that shook the walls, and then, as abruptly as it had appeared, it vanished. The room fell silent, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. We had performed the ritual, but I was unsure if it had truly worked or if the curse would come back stronger. As Clara packed up the ritual items, I was left with a gnawing fear that the worst was yet to come. The entity was gone for now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still lurking, waiting for another chance to strike. With the ritual complete, I could only hope that we had managed to break the curse. The next few days would tell if our efforts had been enough, or if we were still trapped in a nightmare of our own making. The days following the ritual were tense and filled with uncertainty. Although the oppressive atmosphere in the house seemed to have lifted, the sense of dread never quite dissipated. I watched every family member closely, waiting for signs that the curse had been broken or if it was still lurking, ready to strike again. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, I received a phone call from Clara. Her voice was urgent and strained. "I've been researching more about the curse," she said. "There's something important I need to tell you. The entity might not be gone entirely. There's a chance it's still bound to you." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked. "The curse might be lingering," Clara explained. "Sometimes the entity can be driven away temporarily, but if it's not completely severed from its source, it can come back. We might need to perform another ritual to fully eradicate it." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. I thought we had done everything we could, but now it seemed that the curse was still a threat. I called a family meeting and explained the situation to everyone. We were all on edge, and the idea of facing the entity again was terrifying. That night, Clara and I prepared for the final confrontation. We decided to perform a more intensive ritual, one that would require the involvement of the entire family. The ritual was meant to not only drive away the entity, but to completely sever its connection to us. Clara brought additional items: holy water, blessed candles, and an old tome with more powerful incantations. As we set up for the ritual, the atmosphere in the house grew heavy once more. The shadows seemed darker, and the air felt thick with unease. We gathered in the living room, and Clara began to instruct us on our roles in the ritual. Each person had a specific task: holding candles, chanting phrases, and maintaining a protective barrier. The ritual commenced, and as Clara chanted the ancient incantations, I felt a strange sensation, like an electric current running through the room. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the familiar, ominous whispers began again. The figure from the photo appeared, more menacing than ever, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The entity seemed to fight against the ritual, trying to break free from the protective circle we had created. It writhed and twisted, its form shifting and darkening. I could hear its angry growls and feel its chilling presence pressing against the barrier. Despite our fear, we pressed on, focusing on the task at hand. Clara's voice was steady but strained, her eyes locked onto the entity. The family chanted in unison, their voices blending together in a powerful chorus. The entity roared in frustration, and the room shook with the intensity of the confrontation. Just when it seemed like we might not succeed, Clara performed a final powerful incantation. The room erupted in a blinding flash of light, and a forceful wind swept through, extinguishing the candles and scattering the protective salt. The figure let out a final, ear-piercing scream before it disintegrated into nothingness. The silence that followed was almost deafening. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief mixed with exhaustion. We had faced the entity head-on and, for now, it seemed that we had driven it away. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house began to return to normal. The accident stopped, and the nightmares ceased. The dark shadow that had plagued us was gone, leaving behind a sense of cautious optimism. However, I knew better than to let my guard down completely. The curse had been a harsh reminder of how easily something malevolent could infiltrate our lives. We were safe for now, but the experience had changed us all. We learned to appreciate the safety we had and to value each other more deeply. As I looked at the family photo once more, I felt a bittersweet sense of closure. The image that had once symbolized a nightmare now held a memory of our struggle and triumph. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, we had the strength to confront our fears and fight for our survival.
The Night Visitor.
I'm a single mother living with my 2 kids in a charming suburb of Seattle. Our home had always been our sanctuary, a place where the clamor of the world felt miles away. That is, until about a month ago, when our tranquility began to unravel. It started subtly, a faint scratching at the window, like the scrape of nails against glass. I brushed it off as the wind or maybe the house settling, but the noises grew more insistent. It was a series of creaks and groans, echoing through the night, that began to gnaw at my nerves. The sound of footsteps on the floorboards became a regular, unnerving presence. At first, they seemed harmless, just odd noises that could be explained away. But they quickly became more intrusive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One night, I was jolted awake by a thunderous bang that reverberated through the house. My heart pounded in my chest as I leaped out of bed. I stumbled through the darkened hallway, my hands shaking as I reached for the light switch. The beam from the flashlight I carried cut through the darkness, illuminating a quiet, empty house. I checked on my kids, Jake, my 7-year-old, and Lily, my 5-year-old. They were nestled under their blankets, their innocent faces illuminated by the faint glow of the nightlight in their room. They were undisturbed, but I felt far from calm. I continued my search, moving from room to room. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and each noise seemed magnified in the silence that followed. I inspected every closet, every nook and cranny. I even checked the back door and windows, finding them locked and secure. My logical mind was screaming that it was nothing, just an old house making noise, perhaps. But my gut was telling me otherwise. As the days went by, the disturbances persisted. Every night, the noises returned with a new sense of urgency. Sometimes it was a scratching, other times a faint whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. The quiet of the house at night became a breeding ground for my growing anxiety. I lay awake in bed, my ears straining to catch any sound, my eyes fixed on the darkened ceiling. The weight of the silence was almost more oppressive than the noises themselves. In a bid to regain control, I decided to install security cameras around the house. My friend had suggested it, and though I was hesitant, I agreed. I hoped they would capture some evidence of whatever was causing these disturbances. I imagined seeing an animal scurrying about, or maybe finding out it was just an old house making its usual noises. But deep down, I was terrified of what I might discover. The cameras were set up strategically, one in the living room, one in the hallway, and another facing the kids' rooms. I double-checked the connections, made sure the batteries were fresh, and then, as the house settled into another uneasy silence, I tried to convince myself that this was the solution. At least if there was something there, I'd have proof. Little did I know that the cameras would reveal something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. The first night with the new security cameras was almost eerily calm. I went to bed feeling a glimmer of hope that the cameras might finally put my mind at ease. But I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing with anticipation and dread. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts churning with what I might see. At dawn, I stumbled out of bed and went straight to my computer to review the footage from the previous night. I was met with a series of clips showing nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual nighttime scenes of a quiet house. The living room was still, the hallway was empty, and the kids' rooms were peaceful. I sighed with relief, though a part of me remained uneasy. Perhaps it was just a figment of my imagination, I thought. The second night, I felt a renewed sense of resolve. I checked the cameras before bed, making sure everything was functioning properly. I had to know if the disturbances were real or if I was losing my grip on reality. I fell asleep with the monitor on my bedside table, ready to wake at the first sign of anything strange. When morning came, I was both hopeful and apprehensive as I reviewed the footage. The first few clips were uneventful, but then, just past midnight, something caught my eye. There was a subtle shift in the hallway camera, a shadow, almost imperceptible, moving across the screen. My heart skipped a beat. I replayed the segment, focusing intently. The shadow seemed to glide rather than walk, and it was fleeting, almost like a wisp of smoke. I scrolled through the footage frame by frame, and there it was again, the shadow, moving in and out of the view of the camera with an unnerving grace. It was clear now that it wasn't a trick of the light. The shadow appeared to be aware of the cameras, moving with a deliberate intent. My breath quickened as I watched the shadow pass through the hallway, stopping briefly in front of the kids' rooms. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps a malfunction in the camera. But as I continued to watch, the shadow seemed to take on a more defined shape. It wasn't just a blur anymore. It looked almost like a figure, though its features were distorted and hazy. It moved with an unnatural fluidity that made my skin crawl. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The shadow wasn't just a figment of my imagination or an anomaly in the footage. It was something else, something that shouldn't be there. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. What was this thing? Why was it so interested in our home? The unease I felt grew into a palpable fear. I knew I had to keep monitoring the footage, but the thought of watching more of these disturbing recordings was almost too much to bear. I sat there, staring at the screen, as the shadow danced across the camera views, each movement more unsettling than the last. I had hoped the cameras would provide comfort, but instead, they had exposed a reality far more terrifying than I could have imagined. The days blurred together as my fear grew with each passing night. The shadow on the footage was becoming bolder, more frequent. I found myself obsessively checking the cameras, my anxiety mounting with every click of the mouse. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to watch the live feed from my phone in the darkened comfort of my bedroom. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards, but I kept my eyes glued to the screen. My pulse raced as I scanned the feeds from the living room, the hallway, and the kids' rooms. Suddenly, the hallway camera flickered, and there it was again, the shadow. It seemed to materialize out of nowhere, gliding through the frame with an eerie grace. I watched in a mixture of dread and fascination as it moved toward the kids' rooms. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a chill creep down my spine. I kept telling myself it was just a trick of the light or a malfunction, but deep down, I knew better. As I watched, the shadow appeared to pause directly outside Jake's room. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see the dim glow of his nightlight casting a weak halo around the frame. The shadow seemed to linger, almost as if it was scrutinizing the room. I wanted to scream, to wake up my kids and check on them, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. The shadow eventually moved on, but it did so with an unsettling purpose. It drifted through the living room, where it seemed to examine the objects scattered on the coffee table and the couch. It was as if it was taking an inventory of the space. The sight was both fascinating and horrifying. How could something so elusive be so methodical? My fear turned into a kind of obsession. I began to notice other anomalies in the footage. Occasionally, objects in the house would move on their own. A book would fall off a shelf, a cushion would shift on the couch. I reviewed the footage frame by frame, but the movements were subtle, almost as if they were being manipulated by an unseen hand. One night, the shadow appeared again, but this time it was different. It seemed to take on a more defined, almost human-like shape, though its features remained indistinguishable. It hovered near the camera, as if it was aware of being watched. My breath caught in my throat as the figure moved closer to the camera lens, its form becoming more tangible, though still shadowy and distorted. It was as if it was deliberately showing itself to me, taunting me with its presence. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by an irregular object. But every time I reviewed the footage, the fear was undeniable. This wasn't just a shadow, it was something else, something that seemed to exist outside the bounds of normalcy. I felt a creeping sense of dread that I couldn't ignore. Each night, I hoped the cameras would show something mundane, something that could ease my fears. But with each new recording, the shadow grew more defined, and my sense of security dwindled. I knew I had to do something, but the thought of confronting whatever was haunting our home was almost too terrifying to contemplate. My sense of dread had reached unbearable levels. The shadow on the footage had become a nightly fixture, its presence growing more disturbing with each passing day. I found myself becoming a prisoner in my own home, too terrified to sleep but too exhausted to stay awake. The cameras were no longer a source of comfort, they had become a harbinger of fear. One night, I decided I had to confront whatever was lurking in our house. I'd already spent too many nights glued to the screen, watching as the shadow danced around our home with its eerie, fluid grace. I needed to know what it was, what it wanted, and why it was so fixated on us. Armed with a flashlight and a trembling resolve, I watched the live feed on my phone as I moved through the house. I started in the hallway, the area most frequently visited by the shadow. Every creak of the floorboards sounded deafening in the silence. I shone the flashlight around, half expecting to see the shadow materialize before me, but found nothing. The hallway was as still as it had ever been. I proceeded to the living room, the room where the shadow had spent considerable time. I inspected every corner, every item of furniture, but there was no sign of disturbance. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The most unsettling part was the kids' rooms. I hesitated before opening the door to Jake's room. The sight of him sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the terror that had taken hold of me, made my heart ache. I stood there for a moment, just watching him, hoping that somehow this nightmare was all in my head. I turned back to the live feed and noticed something strange. The shadow had become more defined, almost solid, as if it were trying to manifest itself fully. It moved closer to the camera lens, and for a brief moment, I saw what looked like a face. It wasn't clearly human, but there were features, eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness and a mouth that was twisted into a grotesque grin. The sight made my blood run cold. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my phone. The shadow's presence was no longer just a vague, unsettling anomaly. It was an unmistakable, malevolent force. It seemed to be toying with me, revealing itself in increments, as if it were savoring my terror. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary intruder or ghost. This thing was otherworldly, something that didn't belong in our reality. The more I watched, the more I felt like I was being drawn into its world. Its movements became bolder, more deliberate. It hovered near the camera, almost as if it was trying to communicate or interact with me. I decided that I had to act. I couldn't keep living in this constant state of fear. I needed to confront the shadow directly, to find out what it wanted and why it had chosen our home as its playground. I started researching anything that might help me understand what I was dealing with. Local legends, paranormal activity reports, anything that could provide a clue. But deep down, I knew that whatever the shadow was, it wasn't something that could be easily explained away or resolved. The more I learned, the more I realized that I was dealing with something far beyond my comprehension. And as the shadow's appearances became more frequent and unsettling, I felt a growing sense of dread that this was just the beginning of something much darker. My days had become a blur of dread and sleepless nights. The shadow had reached a point where its presence was undeniable and increasingly menacing. I felt trapped, not just by the physical confines of my house, but by an overwhelming sense of impending doom. I knew I had to do something drastic. This fear could no longer dictate my life. One night, I resolved to stay up and watch the footage in real time. I wanted to see if I could catch the shadow in the act, to finally understand what it was and why it was targeting us. The kids were at a friend's house for a sleepover, a decision I made out of an instinctual need to protect them from whatever was haunting us. The house was eerily quiet, and the darkness felt suffocating. As the clock struck midnight, I sat in the living room with my laptop open, the security feed displayed on the screen. My eyes were glued to the live footage, my body tense and ready. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The shadow appeared as usual, materializing in the hallway camera's view. This time, it seemed even more deliberate, moving with an almost predatory intent. I watched in a mix of horror and fascination as it glided down the hallway, its form more distinct and horrifying than ever. It was almost as if the darkness had a tangible shape and intent. Suddenly, the shadow stopped in front of the camera in the hallway, its form becoming clearer and more menacing. The figure was unnervingly close to the camera lens now, its eyes glowing with a faint, unnatural light. The grin it wore seemed to widen, twisting into a grotesque expression of malice. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear the sounds coming from the feed. The shadow seemed to be aware of my presence, almost as if it was looking directly at me through the camera. I felt a wave of terror wash over me, but I forced myself to stay focused. I needed answers, no matter how terrifying they might be. I decided to confront the shadow directly. Gathering every ounce of courage I had left, I walked through the house, my flashlight piercing the darkness. I moved toward the hallway, where the shadow had been most active. The air felt heavy and charged with a strange, electric tension. As I reached the hallway, I felt a chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I shone the flashlight around, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was there. For a moment, the hallway was empty, but then I saw it, a figure standing at the end of the corridor, shrouded in darkness. I took a shaky breath and called out, "Show yourself! What do you want from us?" My voice was barely more than a whisper, but it felt like I had shouted into the void. The figure didn't move, but I felt its presence grow more intense, as if it were pressing in on me from all sides. Then, with a sudden burst of courage, I moved closer, my flashlight illuminating the figure. As the light hit it, the shadow seemed to waver, its form flickering like a faulty light bulb. The face that emerged from the darkness was a twisted parody of a human face. Its eyes were dark voids, and its mouth was a jagged, inhuman rictus. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of despair and sadness emanating from the figure. It was as if it were trapped, seeking something it could never find. I realized that this shadow wasn't just an intruder, it was a lost soul, a being caught between worlds, unable to move on. The figure began to dissipate, its form becoming less distinct, as if the very darkness was swallowing it up. I felt a wave of pity for the creature, even as fear still gripped me. As the last remnants of the shadow faded away, I was left alone in the darkness, the oppressive weight of the encounter still lingering. I knew that whatever had haunted us was gone, at least for now. The house was silent once more, and though the terror had subsided, I was left with a profound sense of unease. I had faced the shadow and discovered its tragic nature, but the experience had left me forever changed. As I sat in the now quiet house, I knew I had to move forward. The shadow had revealed itself, and in doing so, it had shown me the fragile line between our world and the unknown. I would never forget what I had seen, but I hoped that by confronting it, I had finally brought some semblance of peace to my home and to the lost soul that had haunted us.
The Whispers in the Nanny.
I always thought moving to a small, quiet town would be the best thing for us. After all, I wanted peace, a safe place to raise my newborn son, and a fresh start after leaving the noise and chaos of the city. My husband, Mark, found a charming, old house on the edge of town. It had character, creaky wooden floors, tall windows, and a backyard that felt like it stretched into the woods forever. It felt perfect, or at least it did at first. The first few days after we moved in were mostly uneventful. Between unpacking and adjusting to life with a baby, I barely had time to think. But then the nights started to feel longer. The house felt too quiet, like the walls were listening. It was silly, I told myself. I was just overtired. We had installed a baby monitor in the nursery, the kind with a camera and speaker, so I could watch our son from the bedroom. I liked being able to check on him without having to get up. It made me feel safe, knowing I could always see him. The first time I heard the sound, it was subtle. I was lying in bed, trying to get some sleep when the monitor crackled to life. I assumed it was just the usual baby noises. Maybe he'd rolled over or stirred in his sleep. But then, a soft whisper drifted through the speaker. I sat up, staring at the monitor. Nothing. My son was still, peacefully asleep in his crib. Maybe it was just interference, I thought. Maybe a neighbor's monitor was crossing signals with ours. I put it out of my mind and went back to bed, though sleep didn't come easily that night. The next few nights, it happened again. The same faint whispers. Sometimes it was just one or two words, too quiet to make out. Sometimes it was like a low conversation, just below the level of understanding. I told Mark, but he brushed it off, saying it was probably a glitch or maybe some stray radio frequency. He wasn't worried, so I tried not to be either. But there was something unsettling about it. Something that made my skin crawl. One night, as I was lying in bed, exhausted from another long day, I heard it again, clearer this time. A voice, soft but insistent, said something that sounded like my name. I shot up, my heart pounding. I grabbed the monitor and stared at the screen. The room was dark, lit only by the dim glow of the nightlight. My son was in the same position, sound asleep. But the voice, it was still there, faint, almost blending with the static. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I got out of bed and went to check on him, my bare feet creaking on the wooden floors. I opened the door to his room as quietly as I could. The room was calm, my son breathing softly in his crib. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I stood there for a while, just watching him, listening. The whispers had stopped the moment I entered the room. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that voice, calling me, whispering through the static of the baby monitor. I kept telling myself it was just the house, or the technology acting up. But deep down, a part of me felt it was something else, something I didn't want to acknowledge yet. I didn't know it then, but that was just the beginning. The whispers didn't stop. In fact, they got worse. Every night, it was the same thing. The monitor would crackle to life, and I'd hear them, soft, indistinct voices. Sometimes just murmurs. Other times it felt like they were having a conversation, just out of my reach. I'd strain to hear, trying to make out the words, but it was like they were talking in a language I didn't understand. The worst part was that these whispers never came when I was in the room. It was as if they were waiting for me to leave, waiting for me to let my guard down. One night, it got so bad I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I sat in bed, holding the monitor in my lap, my heart racing every time the static crackled. I was exhausted, but I couldn't close my eyes, not with those voices filling the dark. Then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, clearer than ever before. Come here. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. My blood ran cold. I froze, my eyes locked on the monitor screen. The camera showed the nursery, dimly lit by the nightlight. My son was lying in his crib, but this time, he wasn't alone. There was something else in the room. A shadow. It wasn't clear, but I could see it. Just a dark blur, moving near the edge of the crib, like it was watching him. I threw the blankets off and rushed into the nursery, my hands shaking as I flipped the light switch. The room flooded with light, and for a moment, I thought I'd see someone standing there. But when I looked, it was empty. Just my son, sleeping peacefully, his little chest rising and falling with each breath. I checked the corners of the room, the closet, under the crib. Nothing. I was imagining things, right? I had to be. But as I stood there, my hands resting on the crib rail, the feeling of being watched crept over me again. The air felt heavy, thick, like something was pressing down on my chest. I grabbed my son and held him close, my eyes scanning the room for any movement, any sign that I wasn't alone. After a while, I calmed down. I told myself it had to be the shadows playing tricks on me, or maybe the monitor was glitching. I wanted to believe that so badly. But then something happened that I couldn't explain away. The next morning, as I was feeding my son in the kitchen, the monitor on the counter crackled to life again. I glanced at it, expecting to hear the usual static or maybe some random interference. But instead, I heard a voice, a man's voice, low and raspy. "Don't leave him alone." I froze. My eyes darted to the monitor, my heart slamming in my chest. The screen showed the nursery, but the crib was empty. I was holding my son in my arms, but the voice didn't stop. It kept whispering, even though there was no one in the room. I quickly turned the monitor off, my hands trembling. I felt like I was losing my mind. I checked the camera, the connection, everything, but it all seemed fine. Yet those voices, that shadow, nothing about this felt normal. Nothing about this felt safe. I told Mark about the voice, about what I had seen in the nursery. He brushed it off again, like always. He said it was just the baby monitor picking up interference, maybe from a neighbor or a passing radio frequency. He even joked that maybe we were getting old police radio signals or something. But I knew better. This wasn't just interference. This wasn't something you could explain with faulty technology. The voice had been clear, deliberate, and whoever or whatever it was, they knew I was listening. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every shift in the wind outside felt like something was moving in the shadows. I kept the baby monitor on, but this time I sat awake, watching the screen, waiting. I wasn't going to let anything happen to my son. But as the hours passed, the whispers came again. Faint at first, then growing louder, like they were closer. And this time, they weren't alone. Along with the voices, I began to hear something else, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers lightly drumming on wood. It was coming from the nursery. I couldn't move. My body locked in place, my mind racing through every possible explanation. But deep down, I knew there was no rational explanation. Something was in there, and it was trying to get to my son. I took a deep breath, stood up, and headed for the nursery. The door creaked open slowly, and I stepped inside. The tapping stopped, but the whispers didn't. They swirled around me, quiet but insistent, like they were coming from the very walls. I walked over to the crib, my hands trembling, and looked down at my son. He was awake, wide awake, and he was smiling. That smile. I had never seen him smile like that before, not while lying in his crib at night. It wasn't the innocent, joyful grin of a baby. No, this smile was different. It felt wrong, like he was aware of something I wasn't. It froze me in place, my breath catching in my throat. I stood there, watching him, waiting for I didn't even know what. The whispers were still there, faint but constant, like a soft breeze brushing past my ears. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew they were talking to me, or worse, talking to him. I could feel it, this invisible presence in the room, lurking just beyond the reach of the light, watching us both. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whispers stopped. The room fell into a deep, oppressive silence. My son's smile faded, and his eyes slowly fluttered shut, as if nothing had happened. As if the strange moment had never existed. I stood there for what felt like hours, trying to steady my breathing, waiting for some sign that it was over. But it wasn't over. The next few days were a blur. I started keeping the baby monitor on all the time, watching it like a hawk, my nerves constantly on edge. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every little sound felt like a threat. Mark noticed I wasn't sleeping, but every time I tried to tell him about the whispers, about the smile, he would just shake his head and say I was tired. He thought it was all in my head, but I knew it wasn't. I knew something was wrong. One evening, I decided to test the monitor. Maybe, just maybe, Mark was right. Maybe it was faulty. I switched it off, grabbed my son, and took him to the living room, setting him down on the playmat. I needed a break from the nursery, from that damn monitor. But as I sat there on the couch, watching my son play with his toys, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. It felt like I was being watched. Not from the window, not from the hallway, but from somewhere closer. Somewhere in the house. I slowly turned my head towards the baby monitor, still lying on the coffee table, switched off. And that's when I heard it. A faint static, coming from the monitor. My heart skipped a beat. It couldn't be. The monitor was off. I grabbed it, staring at the blank screen, and that's when the whisper came through, clear as day. "Mommy." I dropped the monitor. My body froze. My mind raced with panic and disbelief. The voice had sounded just like my son's, but distorted, eerie, as if someone was mimicking him. My eyes shot to my son, sitting innocently on the playmat, babbling to himself. There was no way. He was too young to speak, too young to even understand the word, "Mommy." And yet, the voice was undeniable. It had come from the monitor, from the room where I had left it off. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I called Mark at work, my voice shaking as I tried to explain. But he cut me off, impatiently reminding me that he had a big meeting and couldn't deal with paranormal nonsense. He suggested I take a walk, clear my head, and relax. But I knew walking away wouldn't help. The house wouldn't let me forget. That night, I didn't want to put my son in the nursery. I tried to explain to Mark that I had a bad feeling about it, that something was wrong, but he just looked at me like I was crazy. I couldn't blame him. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. But when it came time to put our son to bed, I hesitated at the nursery door. I didn't want to go back in there. Mark sighed, taking our son from me and putting him down in his crib. He gave me a tired smile, as if to say, "See, nothing's wrong." And for a moment, everything did seem normal. But that night, the baby monitor woke me up again. This time, it wasn't just whispers. I awoke to the sound of something soft at first, almost soothing. It took me a moment to recognize it. A lullaby. A familiar one, like the kind I used to sing to my son when he was just a few weeks old. But I wasn't singing. I was lying in bed, paralyzed with fear, as that sweet, haunting tune drifted through the monitor. I turned to Mark, shaking him awake. He grumbled, half asleep, but I shoved the monitor in his face. "Listen," I whispered, my voice trembling. The lullaby was still playing, soft and eerie. Mark sat up, squinting at the screen. At first, he looked annoyed, but as the song played on, I saw his expression change. He wasn't annoyed anymore. He was confused. And then, he was scared. He didn't say anything. He just stared at the monitor as the camera focused on the crib. Our son was fast asleep, undisturbed by the music. And then, slowly, the camera started to pan. It moved on its own. The camera turned toward the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to gather in a thick, dark mass. Mark's hand gripped mine, and I could feel his pulse racing as fast as mine. The camera kept moving, inching closer and closer to the shadowy corner. I didn't want to see what was there. I didn't want to know. But then, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, sharper, as if they were speaking directly into my ear. "Shh! Don't wake him." I couldn't breathe. The sound of those whispers, closer now, harsher, froze me to the core. "Shh! Don't wake him." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command, and it felt like the voice was right behind me, breathing against the nape of my neck. Mark and I sat there, gripping each other in the dark, unable to look away from the baby monitor. The camera had stopped moving, now focused on the far corner of the nursery. The shadows there seemed thicker, darker than they should have been, swirling unnaturally in the soft light of the nightlight we'd placed by the crib. I half expected to see something step out of those shadows, something terrible. But nothing came. The lullaby had faded by now, replaced by that low, oppressive silence, a silence that pressed against my ears and chest. My son was still asleep, completely oblivious to the horror unfolding just feet away from his crib. Mark was the first to move. Slowly, he reached for the monitor, his hand shaking slightly. "It's just interference," he whispered, but I could hear the fear in his voice. He didn't believe his own words. Maybe the camera's malfunctioning. But we both knew that wasn't true. Something was in that room. Something watching. "I'm going to check on him," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might provoke whatever was hiding in the shadows. I grabbed his arm before he could stand up. "No," I hissed, my voice shaking. "Don't go in there." He looked at me, eyes wide with disbelief. "What do you expect me to do? Just leave him in there." He shook his head, pulling his arm free. "This is insane. I'm going to prove to you that there's nothing wrong." I watched, heart pounding in my chest, as Mark quietly got out of bed and headed toward the nursery. The baby monitor still in my hand, I kept my eyes glued to the screen. I could see him moving down the hall, the faint creak of the floorboards following him, and then he was there. He hesitated at the door, hand on the knob, staring into the room through the crack. I could see the tension in his body, the way his shoulders were hunched like he was expecting something to leap at him the moment he opened the door. My own breath hitched as I watched him slowly push it open and step inside. The camera didn't show him. It remained locked on that corner of the room, the one where the shadows gathered. My pulse throbbed in my ears, my stomach twisted with dread. I heard Mark whisper something, his voice too quiet to make out. Then there was a pause. And then, nothing. I sat up in bed, staring at the monitor. "Mark!" I called out softly. There was no response. My hands trembled as I gripped the device tighter, waiting for him to say something, anything. The seconds dragged on, each one more unbearable than the last. Suddenly, the shadows in the corner shifted. I gasped, bringing my hand to my mouth to stifle a scream. The darkness in that corner moved, not like a person or an animal, but like it was alive, swirling and thickening as though it had a mind of its own. Mark still wasn't in the frame, but I knew he had to be standing right there, right in front of it. The silence that followed was agonizing. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, feel the cold sweat sliding down my back. "Mark," I whispered again, louder this time. Still nothing. And then I saw him. Mark stepped into view, his face expressionless, eyes vacant. He was holding our son in his arms, but something was wrong. His grip on the baby was too tight, and his movements were too stiff, unnatural. He wasn't moving like himself. It was as though he was being controlled. "Mark, what are you doing?" My voice cracked with fear, but I couldn't stop watching. His head turned slowly, too slowly, and he looked directly at the camera. At me. For a split second, I thought I saw something flicker across his face. A smirk, or maybe just a twitch of his lips. It was gone before I could be sure. "He's fine," Mark said flatly, his voice sounding hollow, like it wasn't really his. "Go back to sleep." The monitor flickered, static filling the screen for a brief moment before cutting back to the image of Mark standing by the crib. The shadows in the corner had vanished, leaving only the soft glow of the nightlight. It looked so normal, too normal. But I knew something was terribly wrong. I rushed out of bed and into the hallway, my mind racing with panic. I had to stop him, had to get my son away from whatever had taken hold of my husband. The door to the nursery was wide open when I reached it, and Mark was standing in the exact spot he had been in on the monitor, cradling our son. I didn't want to believe it, but as I looked into Mark's eyes, I saw it. Something dark and unnatural, lurking just behind his gaze. Something that wasn't him. "I told you," he said, his voice unervingly calm. "He's fine." I took a step closer, heart hammering in my chest. "Mark, give him to me," I pleaded, my voice trembling. "Please." For a moment, Mark didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on me, cold and unblinking. And then, slowly, he handed me our son. Relief washed over me as I took him into my arms, feeling his warm, soft body against mine. But that relief was short-lived, because as I turned to leave the room, I heard the whisper again, louder this time. "Don't take him away." I stood frozen in the doorway, clutching my son so tightly that I was afraid I might wake him. But I couldn't loosen my grip, not after hearing that voice again, closer this time, louder, angrier. "Don't take him away." My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. Mark stood behind me, his face eerily calm, watching as if waiting for me to react. The shadows were gone, but the air felt thick, suffocating. It was as if something was still lingering in the room, unseen but unmistakably there, watching, waiting. "Mark," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "did you hear that?" He didn't answer. He just stared at me, eyes glassy and empty, as though he wasn't really seeing me anymore. It wasn't him. I didn't know what had taken hold of him, but it wasn't my husband standing there. The realization hit me like a punch in the gut. Whatever presence had been haunting our son's room, it had done something to Mark. And now it wanted my child. I needed to leave, to get out of that house and far away from whatever was trying to take my family. My son stirred in my arms, his little body shifting slightly, but thankfully he didn't wake. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move, stepping backward slowly, my eyes never leaving Mark's face. His expression didn't change, but I could feel the tension in the room rising, as if the very walls were pressing in on me, trying to trap us inside. As I reached the hallway, the whisper came again, this time more insistent, like a cold breath against the back of my neck. "He belongs to us." My blood ran cold. It was no longer just one voice. It was a chorus, a dissonant blend of whispers and mutterings that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the baby monitor or the air itself, but the words were clear. Something had claimed my child. I turned and ran. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I raced down the hallway, not daring to look back. I didn't care if I was being followed. I had to get out. My son's weight in my arms was the only thing grounding me, the only reminder that I was still in control. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I heard it again. "Don't take him away." This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a scream. The lights in the hallway flickered violently, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. The temperature plummeted, and a bitter chill filled the air, seeping into my bones. I heard footsteps behind me, heavy, deliberate. Mark's footsteps. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't really him. Whatever had taken him was following me, and it wasn't going to stop until it had what it wanted. I bolted down the stairs, my heart racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Every instinct was telling me to protect my son, to keep him safe from the dark, malevolent force that seemed to be closing in on us. But with every step, the house seemed to twist and shift around me, as though it were alive, conspiring against me. The hallway stretched longer, the stairs creaked louder, and the air grew colder. I could feel the presence surrounding us, suffocating us. I reached the front door, my hand fumbling for the lock. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices demanding, pleading, threatening. "Give him to us." My fingers finally found the latch, and I yanked the door open, the cold night air hitting me like a wave of relief. I stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind me, and ran toward the car parked in the driveway. I fumbled for my keys, every second stretching into an eternity as the whispers continued to echo in my head. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped them, but finally, I managed to unlock the car and throw the door open. I strapped my son into his car seat as quickly as I could, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. As soon as he was secure, I slammed the door shut and ran around to the driver's side. But as I reached for the handle, I stopped. Mark was standing at the front door, staring at me. His face was illuminated by the porch light, but it wasn't his face anymore. His eyes were black, hollow, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile that sent a wave of nausea through me. He raised one hand and pointed at me, or rather, at the car. "At our son. He belongs to us," he said, but it wasn't his voice. It was a low, guttural growl, like the thing that had taken over him was finally revealing itself. I yanked open the car door, jumped inside, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me a moment to start the engine, but as soon as I heard the roar of the car coming to life, I slammed my foot on the gas and sped out of the driveway. The whispers faded as I drove away, but the fear didn't leave me. My heart was still racing, my mind still trying to process what had just happened. I glanced in the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see Mark, or whatever had become of him, standing in the middle of the road. But the street was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. I kept driving, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what had happened to my husband. All I knew was that I had to get away, to protect my son from whatever had invaded our home, our lives. But even as I drove, the memory of those whispers lingered in my mind, chilling me to the core. He belongs to us.